Recently, I just published a video on the so-called love triangle murder trial that just started in Austin, Texas this week. It's the story of Kaitlin Armstrong, who is on trial for allegedly murdering a romantic rival and then fleeing to Costa Rica on her sister's passport, where she dyed her hair and got facial reconstruction plastic surgery, basically. Which is just crazy. It's like she had just watched the Jason Bourne series and decided that that's what she wanted to do. Anyway, one of the most tragic parts about this is that Mo Wilson, the victim, doesn't really seem to have been much of a romantic rival in the first place. She had dated the defendant's then boyfriend, Colin Strickland, for like the briefest moment of time when the defendant and her then boyfriend had been on a break from their relationship. It's just so unnecessary for things to have ended up this way, and it honestly breaks my heart that this is where that road led. But on top of that, what we heard on day one of the trial was that the prosecution has receipts upon receipts of all kinds of things like her digital footprint, video surveillance, DNA evidence, and ballistics that places the defendant at the scene of the crime at the time at which it happened. The jury also heard from Mo's brother Matthew as well as her friend Caitlin Cash. They gave a picture of what Mo was like, her brief relationship with Colin, and Cash gave her harrowing account of finding Mo on the floor, calling 911, and trying unsuccessfully to revive her. Then the jury heard from a parade of first responders talking about what they experienced at the scene of the crime, what they analyzed, and also shared their body cam footage. And on day two, this continued. The last witness that we heard from on day one was Sergeant Rolando Ramirez, the homicide detective on the case. And on day two, they started with his cross-examination by the defense. As you can imagine, the defense attorney really wanted to extract from this witness a suspicion that the lead homicide investigator on the case did not investigate this case properly. He did this primarily by trying to push on Sergeant Ramirez's process. What's the routine? What's the standard operating procedure, for example? And the answer was that first, he never relies on what the police officers who first arrived on the scene say about the characterization of the scene. Instead, he goes to the scene itself and gathers the evidence, or at least gathers a picture of the evidence as it sits there. And this is important for any investigation because relying on the officer's recounting would be layering his analysis on top of potentially faulty analysis. By removing the officer's characterization of the scene from his analysis, he's keeping things cleaner in terms of bias. But other than that, he said there's really no standard procedure. And that's because every homicide case is different, and what you do to investigate the case depends on the circumstances of that case itself. On cross-examination, he was asked about why he didn't take specific measurements as to how far away the bicycle was from the apartment, for example, or how far the Jeep was from the door. Sergeant Ramirez said it just wasn't relevant information. And this is where I do wish that we had cameras in the courtroom, because how the witness delivers a response like this can possibly impact the way that the jury accepts or doesn't accept this kind of response. And according to Alex Capariello, the News Nation journalist in the courtroom, Sergeant Ramirez was doing a very good job of talking directly to the jury, engaging with them as he explained what he did to investigate. And even then, I do wish that we had cameras in the courtroom so we could see, because sometimes this kind of eye contact can be totally effective. If you watch Depp v. Heard, for example, Dr. Curry did a fantastic job of this when she was explaining her findings on the witness stand to the jury. But Amber Heard, on the other hand, overdid it. She was, in my opinion, a little bit too forceful with her eye contact, and it felt like she was practically crawling out of the witness stand to try to touch eyeballs with the jury or something. But anyway, from the descriptions, it does sound like Sergeant Ramirez was more on the Dr. Curry end of that spectrum, which means that there's a good chance that the jury was following what he was saying, was engaged in what he was saying, and maybe convinced. I don't know. Now, there are two important parts that the jury was left with before Sergeant Ramirez left the witness stand. First, he said that by the time he finished his shift that night, the person of interest in this case was Colin Strickland, Kaitlin Armstrong's boyfriend. This is an important point in favor of the prosecution because in the opening statement, the defense attorney alluded to an investigation that was basically biased against Kaitlin from the start. The defense attorney in that opening statement basically indicated that the police essentially made an early conclusion that Kaitlin was the one who did it and that they just ran with that theory full force. But what Sergeant Ramirez says here about Colin being the person of interest initially does contradict that. And so the fact that they initially suspected Colin based on the information that they had at the beginning, this suggests that they changed their theory based on the information that became available. This helps the prosecution because it indicates that it was a diligent and reasonable investigation. And one of the last things that he did before he left the witness stand was to go through the factors that led him to believe early on in this investigation that this murder was a personal one. These are things like no signs of a forced entry, a clean apartment, Mo's phone was still left on the charger connected to the wall, and the locations of Mo's gunshot wounds. So far, this sounds to me like a reasonable investigation. Okay, so the next witness for day 2 was yet another Caitlan. There seemed to be an odd number of Caitlins in this trial. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. This was Caitlin Longoria, a crime scene specialist in Austin. She was another one of the people that arrived at the scene on the night of May 11th. And specifically, she was the one that took all of the photographs of the scene. There were around 400 photographs in total. Sometimes I think about the jobs that a lot of these witnesses have, and I just hope that it comes with some kind of availability of therapy, because I can imagine that being a crime scene photographer comes with its fair share of demons and ghosts that can follow you around after a while. But anyway, in this trial, they of course showed some of these photos to the jury. There are graphic descriptions of these photos. I'm not going to go into them in really any detail. Suffice it to say, they're rough and they show everything. The family apparently was there for this, but they were not looking at the photos. The jury, on the other hand, examined them closely. And according to Alex Capariello again, apparently one of the 6 male jury members held his hands in front of his mouth, so we know that the jury was emotionally impacted. Another one of the things that we definitely are curious to know about is what is Caitlan, the defendant here, doing while these things are happening in the courtroom? The jury is of course going to be paying attention to the physical evidence and the testimony and all these different forms of evidence that come into the courtroom, but they also often are going to be watching the defendant for how she's going to react to various things. And apparently when these photos were shown in the courtroom, she was looking directly at the screen, showing these photographs, and she did not have any hint of emotion on her face. This seems like behavior that is within the realm of what we could expect to see from any kind of a defendant, whether they are guilty or innocent. If she was appearing to be in any way disrespectful somehow, that would be obviously totally outrageous. But the lack of emotion on her face during a time like this could be taken one way or another. On the one hand, maybe she's seen them before, and the lack of emotion indicates that she doesn't have emotional attachment to that scene as someone who wasn't there when it happened. On the other hand, maybe she's emotionless about it because she's a cold-blooded killer. I am curious to hear your thoughts on that. Let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, then came the cross-examination, and this was once again focusing on the quality of the investigation. As I said in the day 1 recap, this is always ripe territory for any criminal defendant. There was apparently a question about some perceived carelessness in one of the reports, specifically about who found blood in some part of the scene. And the witness responded that there could have been carelessness in the report. Now, that's not exactly the strongest answer for the prosecution, I suppose, because, you know, it would be nice if the officer could say, no, of course, we 100% did everything absolutely accurately and according to protocol and exactly the way it was supposed to be done. And I'm 100% certain that every single individual that stepped foot in this crime scene did so. But then again, that kind of answer wouldn't necessarily be realistic. And her saying that there could be some kind of carelessness in the report isn't exactly the same thing as her saying that there was carelessness in the report. Anyway, on to the next witness. This was crime scene specialist Katie Ferrara. Miss Ferrara was responsible for collecting the evidence on the night of May 11th. The bicycle, the projectiles, the fingerprints, all of that kind of stuff. She said she took DNA swabs from bloodstains as well as from Mo's body. Then during her testimony, the prosecutors wheeled in Mo's bicycle, and this is a good move. Anytime you can bring in the real material object and place it in front of the jury, it's 1,000 times stronger because you give the jury a sense of the reality of this case. It makes it so much more real and tangible when you can actually see the bicycle that everybody has been talking about in this case. Now, when the bike was first wheeled into the courtroom, it was cased in plastic to preserve it for the jury. And in the courtroom, they cut the plastic off of it, and Miss Ferrara went through the 22 fingerprint cards that were taken from the apartment. They also went over fire cartridge casings found in the apartment, which were all 9mm casings apparently. Now, remember that contrary to what you might see on a TV show like CSI, the person who collects the evidence from the crime scene usually is not the one who then analyzes it or run tests on it. So the testimony about the tests of those fingerprints and DNA blood swabs and any of the other tests regarding the shell casings, all of those are likely to come from a different witness later on down the line. So the testimony about all of those tests to be done on the fingerprints and the DNA swabs and any other testing on shell casings and anything like that is going to likely come from a different witness later on down the line. Anyway, on cross-examination, the defense attorney did elicit some points from Ms. Ferrara about the bicycle. For example, she said that she didn't know how the bike got to the location in which it was found, that she didn't see any noticeable bike tracks, for example, anything like that. And she agreed on the stand that from her vantage point, anyone could have placed the bicycle there. But again, keep in mind that the scope of her knowledge, the scope of her expertise is going to be limited. She's the one that gathers the evidence, not necessarily the one that analyzes it. And so based on the information that she does have through her position in the crime scene, it makes sense that she wouldn't be able to deduce who tossed the bike into the bushes. In fact, it would probably be actually a little bit weird if this witness was like, no, for sure it had to be the defendant. And here's an interesting tidbit to note as well. Apparently, when the defense attorney asked Ms. Ferrara to position the bike how she found it in the bushes, there were some jury members who appeared to be totally disinterested. This means that there are jury members who may or may not be checking out during the defense cross-examination, which would mean that they don't particularly find his questions or the answers to his questions particularly relevant. Obviously, we always want a jury to be going into a trial with an open mind, but there also are no rules as to when the jury makes up their mind about a particular case. And so it may very well be that there are one or more jurors on that panel right now that are already leaning heavily in favor of the prosecution based on what they've seen so far. But anyway, there does seem to be a moment where the defense attorney did catch this witness off guard. She said she couldn't remember who had transported the bike from the crime scene or who was in charge of its delivery. But she did say that if she had to work the crime scene over again, she wouldn't have changed anything. But then the defense attorney asked her about cross-contamination of DNA. Specifically, he asked her about why it's important not to cross-contaminate evidence, and apparently she struggled to answer it, basically doesn't answer it before the defense attorney basically just ends the cross-examination. Her answer here probably doesn't really matter anyway because it's kind of more of a hypothetical question and more of a question that he's probably posing to the jury, but it does seem a little bit strange that she wouldn't have an answer for common sense reasons for why we wouldn't want to cross-contaminate DNA in a crime scene. Anyway, on redirect, the prosecution worked to shore this up. Here, she explained that she doesn't really know that much about DNA processing, but she does know about collecting swabs and admitting these pieces into evidence. And this is basically what is commonly understood about this role. So making sure to clarify that for the jury is an important piece. I do imagine that we will be hearing from someone fairly soon to talk about the analysis of all of these pieces of evidence. Anyway, the next witness was Sergeant Timothy Price. He was another homicide detective at the crime scene that night. He talked about the decision to get fingerprints from the bike and examined the whole apartment. He also talked about the medical examiner's examination of the body, and he goes into all the detail on the stand. But just like with the photos, I'm not going to go into those details here because although the jury needs to hear all of these for completion of the presentation of the case, the way that Mo died isn't really in question here. And I'm not about to go into all of those sort of salacious details that are gory unless we really have to. But anyway, then the jury got to see more body cam footage from Sergeant Price. And apparently the jurors were all paying close attention to this as it was played. The footage apparently captured everything in the apartment, from Mo on the floor, to the shell casings, to the various gadgets like laptops and phones and things that were left on the couch. And then it shows what Sergeant Price saw outside, including where the bike was found. So really by this point, the jury has to have a very good idea of what the whole crime scene looked like on that night, now that they've seen body cam footage from like half a dozen officers at this point. The one thing that came up on cross-examination was a conversation that Sergeant Price had with Cash's landlord, David Harris. Apparently, Harris hadn't heard any gunshots, despite the fact that he lived in a building that's like right next to Cash's apartment. This may have been one of those situations where there's a house and then basically an annex or a guest house next to it that the person who owns the main house then rents out to someone else. Anyway, Sergeant Price did say that it was strange that Harris didn't hear any gunshots. And so the defense attorney leaned into this, asking why no one searched Harris's home for evidence. Sergeant Price responded that he didn't know if anyone else had followed up with the Harris family. This could be a decent opening for the defense if there isn't really a good reason to exclude the landlord from the list of suspects, especially so early on in the case. But on redirect, the prosecution asked Sergeant Price if there was any real reason, any good reason to go into Harris's home, and Sergeant Price said no. This was because Harris was calm, he was helpful, he was non-evasive, and unaware of what had happened in the apartment. And this is where I once again wish that we could be watching the testimony for ourselves, because I'd want to see how this comes across in real time. The decision to eliminate or focus on particular suspects, especially early on in the case, is an important aspect of the investigative process. But when on cross-examination after the redirect, he did say that he had done his due diligence and that he didn't find a need to search Harris's house. And speaking of the landlord, he's the next witness. Apparently, David Harris is a civil engineer and he lives with his two sons who are aged 19 and 16. He said that on the night of the shooting, he had seen a couple ambulances and some police officers, but that he didn't really think anything of it and that he went to bed. Not long after that, police officers knocked on the door and he cooperated with them. He said on the stand that he didn't have any further contact with the police until a few days later when he saw a plainclothes officer who had a body cam on him talking with some of the neighbors, and Harris approached the officer to give more information that he felt that he needed to give upon further reflection of those events of that night. And he told him that he remembered going to the garage that night to take a bong hit before going for a walk for some exercise. If you're not familiar with Austin, there is a popular saying called "Keep Austin Weird," and that was like literally the first thing that popped into my head once I came across that tidbit. Of course, it's legalized in many, many, many states, maybe a majority of states at this point, but so it's not that fringe, but there was just something about it. Just the idea that someone was going to take a bong hit and then go for a walk for some exercise. It just feels very Keep Austin Weirdish. Anyway, while he was in the garage, he said that he heard a bicycle quickly taking off. He said that when he had opened the garage for some ventilation in the garage, he may have startled someone, causing them to flee. The problem with this account is that his memory is not particularly clear, maybe because he had just taken a bong hit, although he said that he wasn't intoxicated from it. But he can't remember exactly what the time frame was or exactly what he heard, but he remembers thinking that it was a bike. But even still, we know that Caitlin's Jeep was caught on surveillance camera, so it would make sense that she also left in her Jeep, not a bike, particularly since that Jeep was nowhere to be found when the police arrived. So this information does feel to me personally like a little bit of a red herring, or maybe even an opening for the defense to say that Colin had something to do with it because Colin is a professional cyclist. Other than that, as far as the prosecution is concerned, I don't really see how this fits into the overall puzzle of the case. But let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts on this. Anyway, the next witness was the first of a number of witnesses that the jury heard from on day 2. Her name was Martha Palao, and Miss Palao has a Ring doorbell that did in fact catch footage of Caitlin's car on that night. And so through her, of course, the prosecution entered this video surveillance footage into evidence and the jury got to see it. And so what the jury got to see here was that Miss Palao's home surveillance system actually caught Caitlin's Jeep from multiple perspectives, including the front and the back of her home. At 8:26 p.m., the Ring camera caught the Jeep out front. And 11 minutes later, at 8:37 p.m., the Jeep was seen out back by the alley. Miss Palao said that she was at home at the time of the murder, but did not hear any gunshots. And so to me, this actually helps the whole Harris question about why he couldn't hear the gunshots, even though he was home at the time. And this helps to also further minimize the questions about why the police didn't further investigate Harris. Because of a completely unrelated neighbor that wasn't involved in any way with that apartment or the individuals that were connected to it, if she didn't hear the gunshots herself, despite being around and awake at the time, it seems way more reasonable that Harris also would not have heard these gunshots. Okay, so then the jury heard from another neighbor. This was Michael Donlin. He also has a Ring doorbell, which records video and audio. Specifically, his Ring camera shows his front porch. In it, you can see the Jeep slowly passing by after 8 p.m. There's apparently no timestamp on this piece, but he apparently verified the approximate time that this happened before sending it to the police. But there's a second video from the same vantage point that shows the Jeep passing by slowly again, this time at 8:08 p.m. So it had a timestamp on that one. And then at 8:26 p.m., the Jeep is going in a different direction again slowly. And this is where I have to make a correction on something that I said in the recap for day 1. Previously, I said that there was an audio recording from Cash's Ring doorbell that recorded Mo's terrified last moments. I was mistaken about that. The audio of that actually comes from Mr. Donlin's Ring app. At 9:15 p.m., it recorded the distant but audible sound of a woman screaming and 2 consecutive gunshots. Then you hear a pause and a third gunshot. Anyway, after that, the next witness is another neighbor with yet more video surveillance footage. This neighbor's name was Andrew Vuong. His video surveillance showed that at 8:02, the black Jeep moved slowly down the street. At 8:23, it heads in the other direction, circling the block. And for 2 to 3 minutes, it idles directly in front of Vuong's home before moving on. It's pretty wild to me to think that there's just so much that was captured by the neighbor's home security systems. I mean, they were really able to track this Jeep's movements with detailed timestamps. On the one hand, it's really kind of incredible that we can piece this kind of material together at this level of specificity in a case like this. But on the other hand, it kind of gives me the creeps a little bit. Like, it makes me wonder just how much of our lives is observable by third parties of our devices and the devices that are owned by other people around us. It's pretty remarkable one way or another. But as far as this case is concerned, this appears to be day 2 of burying the defendant with receipts. I think that the defense is trying to do what they can do to sort of muddy these waters and foment some distrust and maybe some suspicion of these police officers. And the truth is that today there is quite a bit of that already across the United States anyway. And also, thank you to a couple commenters on the last video who are local to Austin who let me know about controversies that have come out about the Austin Police Department in recent years. So what I said yesterday about Austin being a little more politically left-leaning and that there are so many people who live there that aren't from there is true, yes, and that can have a cultural impact, of course, but these specific controversies could also have a further potential impact on the jurors. But that said, even despite these potential questions or suspicions that jurors might have about the police or relative distrust that they might have about the police, it seems at this point that there's just so much here in favor of the prosecution. And on top of that, the jury is also hearing directly from people like Kaitlin Cash and the neighbors who had their own surveillance systems. These neighbors are peers to the jury, and so they have really no reason to distrust any of these neighbors. So the more that the jury hears from these kinds of witnesses, in addition to all of the police officers and other first responders and whatnot, the more it helps to sort of quell concerns that the police may have been trying to snag the wrong person. But that's day 2, and those are my thoughts. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I apologize for getting these recaps out to you a little slowly. Definitely slower than I had wanted to. As you can tell, I am dealing with a little bit of health stuff myself, so I'm trying to balance things out here as much as I possibly can while still trying to get these out as early as possible. And I'll be getting day 3 to you as soon as possible. And also, this trial is supposed to be lasting 3 to 4 days, so I do anticipate that those closing arguments will be coming up very soon. And when they do, we absolutely will be live streaming them on this channel. So be sure to keep updated and join us for closing arguments. And of course, the best way to stay updated and be notified about those is to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't done so already. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.